The wind never seemed to stop across the high plains, rattling through the brittle grass and sighing against the old wooden posts of a ranch that had seen better days. The place was quiet now, almost too quiet. Once it had been filled with the sounds of cattle, the laughter of ranch hands, the bustle of wagons and horses, but all of that had faded with the years. Only one man remained, a retired cowboy who had chosen solitude as his final companion. His boots were worn, his hat faded by the relentless sun, and his eyes carried the weight of stories that few had ever heard. Folks in the nearby town whispered about him from time to time, wondering why he never came around except for supplies, why he never took company, why he chose to live alone on the edge of nowhere. Some said he had lost too much in life. Others thought he simply preferred the silence. But deep down, he knew it wasn't choice alone that kept him apart. It was something heavier, something unspoken. Day after day, his life had become a pattern. Wake before dawn, brew coffee strong enough to stand a spoon, mend what needed mending, ride the fence line, and watch the sun set over the hills. The quiet had a way of pressing on a man's chest, but he had learned to carry it the same way. He once carried a saddle or a rifle. Nights were the hardest. The old cowboy would sit on his porch with a lantern at his side, listening to the coyotes cry, staring into the horizon as though waiting for someone who would never return. He had convinced himself that this was the way it would always be, just him, the land, and the silence. But fate has a way of stepping in when a man least expects it. One evening, as the sun bled red against the faraway mountains, he spotted movement near the edge of his property. At first, he thought it was wild mustangs drifting across the grass, but as the figures drew nearer, he could see they weren't horses at all. They were people, 5 women walking together, tired and dust-covered, moving slow but steady. Their clothes told a story before they ever spoke. Woven dresses worn thin, blankets pulled tight against the cooling air, and eyes that carried both sorrow and strength. They were Apache widows, and their presence on his land was as surprising as it was unsettling. The cowboy stood from his chair, gripping the railing of his porch as his heart hammered in his chest. He had lived long enough to know that appearances could mean everything or nothing at all. Why were they here of all places? He had no family, no reason for visitors, and the last thing he expected was to see 5 women standing at the edge of his ranch, looking toward him with a mix of desperation and hope. When they finally reached the porch, one of the women spoke. Softly, her voice steady despite the long miles they had walked. She explained that they had nowhere else to go. Their husbands were gone, their homes lost, and the world beyond had turned cold to them. They were not asking for much, only shelter, a place to rest, a roof strong enough to keep the night wind away. The cowboy's first instinct was to turn them away, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. He had built walls around his life, invisible ones meant to keep pain at a distance. For years, those walls had worked. But now, looking into the weary eyes of 5 widows, he felt something stir inside him that he had long thought dead: responsibility, perhaps, or compassion, or maybe a simple recognition of loneliness. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched them, studying the way they stood close together, the way their hands carried both weariness and resolve. He thought of his own empty house, the rooms that hadn't heard a human voice in years, the kitchen where he still cooked as though for someone else out of habit, and the quiet that seemed to echo louder with each passing season. Could he truly let them in? What would it mean to share his life again, even in the smallest way? The prairie seemed to hold its breath as he weighed his choice. The widows waited silently, not begging, not pleading, simply standing strong in their need. There was dignity in the way they carried themselves, even as the dust of hardship clung to them. The cowboy felt his throat tighten. He finally told them they could stay the night, but only the night. It was safer that way, he reasoned, both for them and for him. But even as he spoke the words, he knew something had shifted. The sound of footsteps in his yard, the murmur of voices in his kitchen, the sight of lantern light flickering against faces other than his own, it was all foreign, yet strangely familiar. For the first time in many years, the house did not feel like a tomb dot as darkness settled across the plains. The widows laid their blankets near the hearth while the cowboy sat back in his chair, watching the flames dance. He told himself it was only temporary, that by morning they would move on and he would return to his solitude. But deep down, he could not ignore the truth. Nothing about this night felt temporary. Something had begun, though he didn't yet know what dot, and as the fire crackled low, he found himself wondering what tomorrow would bring. Would they truly leave at sunrise? Or would this unexpected meeting tie their fates together in ways he could not yet imagine? The answers would come with time, but for now, he was left staring into the flames, knowing that the silence he had once embraced might never return. What he didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. The arrival of 5 Apache widows on his lonely ranch would change everything, his routines, his peace, and perhaps even his heart. The man who had lived alone for so long was about to learn that the past does not always dictate the future, and that sometimes, when the wind shifts across the plains, life brings you exactly what you never knew you needed. But as the night grew colder and the coyotes howled in the distance, the cowboy sat quietly, torn between the life he knew and the life that might be unfolding before him. And somewhere deep inside, he realized that the real question was not whether he could give them shelter, but whether he could open the doors he had kept locked for so many years. The answer would not come easily. And as dawn crept closer, it became clear that the hardest days and the greatest tests were still ahead. The morning came quietly, the way mornings often did on the plains. A pale light stretched over the horizon, painting the land in soft gold, and the air held a sharp chill that cut through even the thickest blankets. The cowboy rose early, as he always did, and brewed his coffee before stepping outside. The world felt different somehow, though nothing had changed in the landscape. The fences still leaned against the wind, the barn door still creaked, and the horses still shifted restlessly in their corral. But inside the house he could hear movement, soft voices, the shuffling of feet, the kind of sounds he had not heard under his roof in years. He lingered on the porch longer than usual, gripping the tin cup in his calloused hand, unsure how to step back inside. It was easier, in some ways, to face the endless land than to face the unexpected company he had allowed into his home. When he finally returned indoors, the widows were already awake, their blankets folded neatly, their belongings stacked carefully by the wall. They had not taken more than a corner of the house, though he had plenty of space. It was clear they carried a quiet discipline, a respect for boundaries. The women offered him a simple greeting, nothing more. There was no chatter, no prying questions. Just a steady presence that seemed both strong and fragile at the same time. He had expected perhaps a kind of neediness, a demand for more than he could give. But instead, they carried themselves with dignity, and that unsettled him in a way he hadn't prepared for. He asked, almost reluctantly, where they planned to go. The oldest of the group, her dark hair streaked with silver, answered in a calm voice. They had no certain place. The land that once belonged to their people had been taken, the villages broken apart, and the men who might have guided them were gone. They were left with little more than each other, wandering between towns and camps, often turned away. They had come this far because someone had told them that the cowboy's ranch stood alone, far from the noise of the world, and maybe, just maybe, he would let them stay. The cowboy said nothing for a long time. His instinct was to keep his heart shut, the way he had for years, but their story tugged at something deep inside him. He had known loss too, though he had buried it under silence. He didn't share details, but the truth was simple. He had once had a family, and then he didn't. That kind of emptiness leaves a man wary of opening doors again. Still, he could not send them away. Not yet. He told them they could remain a little longer, but only until they found another place. His voice was steady, but inside he felt the weight of his own words. He had once built a life on rules and orders, but now he felt those same rules bending under the strain of compassion. The days that followed were uneasy at first. The widows worked quietly, helping without being asked. They fetched water from the well, swept the dust from corners long neglected, and even mended small things he had put off fixing. The cowboy didn't thank them directly. He wasn't used to speaking much at all, but he noticed. And noticing unsettled him more than anything else. He began to wonder about their pasts, though he didn't ask. Each woman carried her sorrow differently. The youngest had eyes that looked far away, as though she dreamed of something beyond the plains. Another seemed to watch everything closely, always alert, as though expecting danger. The older one, who spoke most often, carried herself like someone who had seen too much yet refused to bend. Their silence spoke volumes, and he found himself studying them in the same way he once studied the sky for weather signs. The townsfolk eventually noticed too. The cowboy went to town one afternoon for supplies, and whispers followed him from porch to porch. People asked who the women were, why they were with him, what business he had taking in strangers. He answered little, giving the same steady silence he always had, but he could feel the weight of their judgment. Out here, rumors spread faster than wildfire, and the presence of Apache widows on his ranch would stir unease in people who never trusted what they didn't understand. When he returned home, he caught himself glancing toward the horizon more than usual, as though half expecting riders to appear. Trouble had a way of finding men who stood apart, and now it seemed he had given it reason. He thought about telling the widows they needed to leave, but when he saw them gathered near the corral, tending to the horses with gentle care, the words died in his throat. Nights were different too. The house that once echoed with silence now held low murmurs, the crackle of a shared fire, the sound of soft prayers spoken in a language not his own. At first, the cowboy found it unsettling, like the land itself had changed shape. But slowly, he began to realize that the quiet he once thought he wanted had been less about peace and more about emptiness. Still, unease lingered. He didn't know what their presence might mean for him or for them. He didn't know what dangers might follow them or what new burdens might fall on his shoulders. Each day seemed to deepen the mystery of why they had come and whether their crossing paths was accident or fate. And then there were the looks, small, fleeting glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't watching. It wasn't fear exactly, but something else, as if they were weighing whether he could be trusted with more than shelter. He felt the same tug in himself, a pull he tried to ignore. The cowboy had lived too long behind his own defenses to let them crumble easily. But each day made it harder. One night, as the fire burned low, the oldest widow finally asked him a question he had avoided since the first evening: why he lived alone. Her voice was quiet, respectful, but steady. The room fell silent, the others waiting, their eyes fixed on him. For the first time in years, he felt words rising in his chest, pressing to be spoken. But when he opened his mouth, no answer came. The truth was too tangled in pain, too locked away. He only shook his head and turned back to the fire. The widows said nothing more, but their silence carried weight. They didn't press, and that somehow unsettled him even more. It left him wondering if they already understood more about him than he wanted them to. As the days stretched into weeks, the land around the ranch seemed to take on a different tone. Storm clouds gathered more often, coyotes lingered closer at night, and the cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He didn't know whether it was trouble from the town, danger from beyond, or something inside himself that was about to break loose. The widow stayed, and he allowed it, though he still told himself it was only temporary. But each morning he found himself expecting their presence. Each evening he found himself listening for their voices. The silence he once thought was his companion now seemed unbearable at the thought of losing it. And yet, deep down, he knew life on the frontier never allowed anything to remain still for long. Sooner or later, the calm would shatter. The question that gnawed at him was whether he was strong enough to face what was coming, or whether the widows had brought more than just sorrow to his door. The answer, like so much else, hung in Nafaz, air waiting for the moment when the plains would reveal it. And in the heart of that uncertainty, the cowboy lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, knowing that his days of solitude were truly over, though the cost of what was to come had yet to be revealed. The days that followed seemed to stretch and twist in ways the cowboy hadn't expected. What was supposed to be one night of shelter turned into another, and then another, until time itself felt blurred. He told himself it was only until they found a better place, but he never pressed them to leave. Each morning, when he stepped outside with his coffee steaming in the cold air, he found the widows already moving about, tending to small chores without being asked. They gathered kindling, patched up a section of fence, carried water from the well, and even kept the animals calm when storms rolled in. It unsettled him, seeing how naturally they blended into a routine that once belonged only to him. The silence he had guarded so carefully was filled now, not with noise but with a steady hum of life. The women spoke little of their pasts, but fragments surfaced in the way they moved, in the way they looked at the land. One evening as the firelight flickered, the youngest widow sat apart from the rest, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Her eyes were far away, fixed on something the cowboy couldn't see. He didn't ask what she was thinking, but he wondered. Each of them carried ghosts, though none of those ghosts had names on his ranch. He realized he was curious, though curiosity was a habit he had buried long ago. In town, whispers grew louder. The cowboy noticed the stares when he walked into the general store. A few men leaned against the counter, muttering behind their hands. He didn't need to hear the words to know their meaning. To them, the widows were outsiders. To him, they were simply human souls trying to survive. But he also knew the prairie had its own way of deciding who belonged and who didn't. He tried to keep his head down, purchase what he needed, and leave without fuss. Still, the weight of judgment clung to him like dust on his boots. Back at the ranch, he couldn't shake a restless feeling. Sometimes at night, he swore he heard distant hoofbeats, faint but steady, as though riders were moving just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. Other times, he felt eyes on him when he rode the fence line, though the hills lay empty. The widows, too, seemed alert to something unseen. One of them often paused in her work, turning toward the horizon as if listening. Their silence about their troubles did not mean trouble wasn't out there, circling like a wolf in the dark. The cowboy began to notice how easily the widows moved as one. When the wind picked up, they pulled the blankets tighter around each other. When one worked, the others joined without question. It was not the kind of order drilled into soldiers or ranch hands. It was something deeper, born from shared loss and the need to endure. He envied that bond, though he would never say so aloud. His own bonds had long ago been broken, and the ache of it still lingered like an old wound that refused to heal. On a cold evening, the oldest widow sat across from him at the table, her eyes steady on his face. She asked him again, softly, why. He lived alone. The question was simple, but it cut through him like a blade. He stared at the lantern between them, watching the flame bend and sway. He wanted to tell her of the past he had buried, the family he once had, the mistakes, the losses that had carved him hollow. But the words would not form. He only shook his head, and she didn't ask again. Yet he could tell she saw more in his silence than he wished. As the weeks slipped by, he found himself caught between two worlds. Part of him clung to the old habits of solitude, of keeping his heart guarded. The other part felt pulled toward the warmth that these women brought, a warmth he had nearly forgotten existed. At night, lying awake in his bed, he thought of the strange way fate had set their paths to cross. Was it chance or something more? Out here, life rarely gave answers. Widows began to plant small things near the cabin, using scraps of seeds they carried. It was late in the season, but they said it was worth trying. The cowboy watched from the porch as their hands worked the earth, steady and patient. He hadn't seen anyone care for the land that way in years. His own work on the ranch had become about survival, not growth. Their efforts stirred something in him he didn't expect: hope, fragile but undeniable. Still, a shadow hung over them. He knew that the land they walked on was watched by others, men who might not take kindly to their presence. He had seen the way the sheriff in town narrowed his eyes when he asked about supplies. He had caught the mutters about strays and trouble. The cowboy had dealt with trouble before, but he was older now, slower, and the weight of responsibility felt heavier when it wasn't just his own life at stake. Sometimes, late at night, he caught the widows whispering among themselves in low voices, words he couldn't understand. Their tone carried both sorrow and warning. He never interrupted, but he listened. Their secrets were not his to demand, but he knew enough to sense they had been running from something more than just hunger or cold nights, and that something might not be finished with them yet. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he rode out farther than usual. The land stretched wide, but near a dry creek bed he found fresh tracks horses, several of them, moving in a group. He crouched low, his hand brushing the dirt, and felt the unease crawl up his spine. Whoever they weren't passing through. They were circling, watching. When he returned to the ranch, he said nothing of what he saw. The widows carried enough burdens already. But his eyes lingered longer on the horizon now, and he kept his rifle closer at hand. He told himself it was just precaution, though deep down he knew better. Out here, nothing happened without reason. As days turned colder, the widows grew more rooted in the house. Their presence became part of the rhythm of the place, the sound of laughter faint and rare, the smell of food simmering, the soft light spilling from windows that had once been dark. The cowboy moved through it all like a man caught between memory and reality. It was dangerous, the stirring of life where only silence had been. He knew that. And yet, he couldn't deny the change. One night, as the wind howled hard enough to rattle the shutters, the youngest widow stood by the fire, her eyes glowing with the reflection of the flames. She turned to him suddenly and asked if he was afraid. The question startled him more than any he had heard. He wanted to deny it, to say he feared nothing after all these years. But the truth pressed heavy in his chest. He was afraid not of death, not of loneliness, but of what it meant to care again. He didn't answer her, not with words. He only met her gaze for a moment before looking away. She didn't press. But in that silence, he knew she understood. The ranch had become more than a place of solitude. It had become a crossing ground where past and present collided, where sorrow met survival, and where 5 Apache widows and a retired cowboy found themselves bound by something none of them had expected. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that everyone felt but no one could name. And as the nights grew longer, the cowboy knew one thing for certain: their lives had been set on a path that could not be undone. What waited for them beyond the horizon was still hidden, but it was coming, steady as the wind across the plains. Winter came early that year. The kind of winter that crept in quiet and fast, as if the land itself wanted to test the strength of those who lived on it. The cowboy woke one morning to find frost thick on the windows and the air sharp enough to burn the lungs. He had spent many winters alone, the silence of the plains broken only by the crackle of firewood and the long sigh of the wind. But this year was different. The house was no longer hollow. He could hear the soft stirrings of the widows as they rose from their blankets, the low murmur of voices, the faint rhythm of their footsteps moving across the floor. It was a strange comfort, though he still told himself he didn't need it. The widows had settled into a rhythm, but their presence did not erase the unease that followed them. Sometimes in the dead of night, the cowboy caught one or two of them awake by the fire, their eyes heavy with thoughts they never spoke. He noticed how the oldest one often stood at the doorway, staring into the dark as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the horizon. When he asked once, her answer was only a soft shake of her head, but her silence told him more than words could. They were waiting for trouble, and so was he. The ranch became a place of contradictions. By day, there was a fragile peace. The widows cooked meals that reminded him of things long gone, beans simmered with wild herbs, bread baked slowly on stones near the fire. They sewed, repaired what could be mended, and even found ways to laugh, though their laughter was faint and fleeting, as if it came from another world. But beneath it all lay a tension no one could ignore. The cowboy felt it in the way his horses spooked at shadows, in the way his own hands lingered near the rifle more often than before. One afternoon, as he rode out to check the fence line, he found more signs of riders' hoof prints deep in the mud, too many for a casual passing. The tracks circled near his land before vanishing back into the hills. He crouched down, his fingers brushing the soil, and his jaw tightened. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching. When he returned, he kept his discovery quiet, but the widows seemed to sense it anyway. Their voices grew quieter, their movements more guarded. The youngest, who once hummed softly while working, stopped altogether. The cowboy realized then that whatever they had fled from was not behind them entirely. It was circling closer, patient as the winter itself. The conflict wasn't only outside. Inside the house, the cowboy found himself struggling against parts of himself he thought he had buried. The widows stirred memories of the family he had lost, faces he still saw in dreams, voices that haunted him in the quiet. He had built walls to keep that pain out, but now those walls were cracking. When he saw the youngest widow smile faintly at the firelight, he felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't allowed in years. It frightened him more than any danger outside. The oldest widow, sharp-eyed and steady, noticed too. One evening, when the others had drifted to sleep, she sat across from him and spoke in a low voice. "You think you are alone in your sorrow," she said, her words careful, accented but clear. "But sorrow does not belong to one man. It belongs to all of us." The cowboy didn't answer. He only stared at the flames, his hands tightening around the mug he held. Her words lingered, though. Long after the fire had died in town, the tension deepened. The general store clerk avoided his eyes now, pushing supplies across the counter. Without a word, a pair of ranchers muttered openly about him as he passed, their words sharp with suspicion. "Strays don't belong here," one of them said loud enough for him to hear. He didn't answer, but he felt the weight of their stares all the way back to his wagon. He knew how fast talk could turn into action on the frontier. The question was not if, but when the widows, too, carried their own secrets. One day, as the cowboy split wood near the barn, he overheard two of them speaking in hushed tones. Though he couldn't understand all their words, one phrase cut through clear enough: "They will find us." His axe froze mid-swing. He didn't ask who they were, but the meaning was plain. The past was not finished with them, and now it had followed them onto his land. Despite the danger, bonds began to form in quiet ways. The cowboy noticed how the youngest widow cared for the horses with a gentle hand, how the sharp-eyed one always kept the fire steady, how the oldest guided the others with calm strength. They were survivors, each of them, carrying burdens heavier than most men could bear. In their presence, the cowboy began to feel the stirrings of something he had nearly forgotten: purpose. But with purpose came risk. And he knew that the closer they all grew, the more there was to lose. At night, the prairie seemed to whisper of what was coming. Coyotes yipped in the distance, the wind carried strange sounds, and sometimes the cowboy swore he saw a lantern light flickering far off on the ridge. He began to ride farther each day, scouting the land, his eyes scanning for any sign of riders. Each time he returned, the widows waited in silence, as if they already knew the answer. The conflict stretched in two directions, one outward, against the unseen threat circling closer, and one inward, against the walls the cowboy had built around himself. He didn't know which battle was harder. Some nights, as he lay awake, he wondered if the widows had come to save him from his loneliness, or to drag him into the fight they carried. Maybe both. Winter deepened, and with it came the first real test. One evening, smoke rose faintly in the distance, too far to be an accident, too steady to be harmless. The cowboy stood on his porch, the cold biting through his coat, and watched. The sky darkened with it. The widows gathered behind him, silent but tense, their eyes fixed on the same horizon. None of them spoke, but the truth hung heavy in the air. Whoever was out there was closer now. The cowboy's hand tightened on the railing. He didn't know yet what would come of it, but he knew the days of waiting were nearing an end. The ranch that had once been his refuge had become something else entirely: a place of shelter, a place of secrets, and a place where the past and future would collide. The widows had brought more than sorrow to his door. They had brought a storm, and as the night fell hard over the plains, the cowboy knew there was no turning back. Whatever fight was coming, it would find them here. The only question was whether he had the strength to face it, and whether the widow's hidden truths would be the key to survival, or the very thing that destroyed them all. The smoke on the horizon lingered for days, a dark reminder that someone was out there, closer than the cowboy liked. He rode the fence line twice as often now, scanning the ridges, watching for signs. The hoof prints he found told him enough: there were riders, circling, moving in and out like shadows, never showing themselves fully, but never leaving either. It was a game of patience, and he knew games like that always ended with someone breaking the silence. Inside the house, the widows grew more restless. Their quiet conversations lasted late into the night, their voices low, their eyes glancing often toward the windows. The youngest widow, once soft and hopeful in her manner, now walked with her shoulders drawn tight as though bracing for a blow. The oldest never spoke of fear, but her watchfulness deepened, her gaze always scanning the edges of the land. They all seemed to know what the cowboy already suspected. This waiting would not last forever. The tension reached into the small moments. When the wind rattled the shutters, everyone froze. When a coyote howled too close, hearts quickened. Even the horses in the corral grew restless, snorting at night as though sensing more than the humans could see. The cowboy found himself sleeping lighter, his rifle never more than an arm's reach away, his ears tuned to the faintest sound. One afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode farther west, following a set of tracks he hadn't seen before. They led to an old campfire, still warm, ashes stirred by the wind. Around it were the remains of food and scraps of cloth, proof that whoever lingered out here wasn't just passing through. They were staying close, watching, waiting. He turned back toward the ranch with a knot in his chest. The the certainty that the conflict was no longer distant. It was already at their doorstep. When he returned, the widows were gathered near the barn. They saw his face and didn't ask questions, but the look in their eyes told him they understood. The air between them grew heavier, as though unspoken. Truths pressed against the walls of the house. That night, the youngest widow finally spoke what the cowboy had long suspected. "They follow us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They will not stop." She didn't name who they were, but she didn't need to. Her words explained everything: the fear in their eyes, the long silence about their past. The reason they had come to his ranch at all. The cowboy listened, his jaw set. He had taken them in without asking questions, but now the answers were forcing their way through. He wanted to demand more, but the look on their faces stopped him. They had already lost too much. Whatever hunted them was ruthless, and now he was caught in the middle. In town, the whispers had turned into warnings. A rancher stopped him outside the store, leaning close, his eyes darting nervously. "Men been seen out by the creek," he muttered. "Not from around here. Best watch yourself." The cowboy said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. He loaded the supplies onto his wagon and rode back faster than usual, every sound in the brush making him tighten his grip on the reins. Back at the ranch, he began to prepare without speaking of it. He checked the boards on the windows, fixed the locks on the doors, and made sure the rifles were clean and ready. The widows noticed, and though they said little, they began preparing too. They gathered food, filled water jugs, and set aside what few belongings they had in neat bundles. It was the kind of quiet work done by people who knew a storm was coming and had no illusions about stopping it. Each night the tension grew thicker. The cowboy lay awake, listening to the shifting of feet in the other room, the faintest creak of the floorboards, the low whisper of voices carried on the wind. He began to wonder if this land, once his refuge, had turned into a trap. And yet, he couldn't imagine sending them away now. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The days grew shorter, the light fading faster, and with it came the first true signs of the enemy closing in. One morning, as he rode out to the ridge, he spotted smoke again, not distant this time, but near, too near, rising just beyond the line of trees less than a mile from his ranch. His horse shifted nervously under him, ears flicking at the faint sound of voices carried by the wind. He turned back quickly, his eyes scanning the land, the certainty burning in his chest that the waiting was nearly over. That night, the widows gathered close around the fire, their faces lit by the flicker of flames. The youngest spoke again, her voice low but steady. "They come soon." The cowboy met her eyes and saw no fear there now, only resolve. Whatever had driven them from their homes was about to arrive at his door, and with it, the fragile life they had built together would be tested. The ranch no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like the center of a tightening circle. Every sound outside, every snapping branch, every shifting shadow carried weight. The cowboy walked the grounds. Late into the night, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his eyes on the horizon. The widows watched from the windows, their faces pale in the lantern light. No words were needed. The silence itself was enough to tell the story. And then came the sign that stripped away any doubt. On the third night, as the wind howled across the plains, the cowboy saw it, 3 lanterns glowing faintly on the ridge, moving slowly, deliberately, as though marking their place. They didn't come closer, not yet. They stayed there, watching, waiting. It was a message, clear as any words. The cowboy stood on the porch, his hand gripping the railing so tight his knuckles whitened. Behind him, he could hear the widows gathering, their breath shallow, their eyes fixed on the same glow in the distance. The world seemed to hold still, the night air heavy, the land itself bracing for what was to come. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They all knew the truth now. The fight they had feared, the conflict that had followed them for miles, had finally found its place. The circle was closing, and the ranch stood at its heart. The cowboy felt the old weight of battle settle on his shoulders, heavier now because he was not fighting for himself alone. He had lived years in silence, years in solitude, but that life was gone. Now there were lives inside his walls, lives tied to his own, and the threat outside was not just against him, it was against them all. The night stretched on, every minute, thick with waiting, every sound a warning. The widows did not sleep. Neither did the cowboy. Together, they kept their eyes on the horizon, knowing the storm was closer than ever, knowing the climax of it all was only hours away. The land itself seemed to pulse with the weight of what was coming, and in that moment, the cowboy understood, whatever was about to happen would change them all forever. The lanterns on the ridge burned through most of the night, steady and silent, a reminder that the waiting was almost done. The cowboy stood watch on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes never leaving that faint glow. Behind him, the widows stayed close together, their voices quiet, their breaths uneven. It was the longest night any of them had known, each minute stretching like an hour, each sound outside sharper than it should have been. When dawn finally broke, the ridge was empty again, the lanterns gone. But the message was clear enough, the confrontation was coming, and there was no escaping it. The cowboy spent the day making the ranch ready. He reinforced the doors, checked the rifles, and stacked wood by the windows for cover. The widows worked beside him, silent but steady, preparing food that could last and gathering water. Their movements were not frantic. They were deliberate, like people who had accepted what must be faced. The cowboy respected that. He had fought alongside men who panicked at the first sign of trouble. But these women carried themselves with a quiet strength that humbled him. That evening, as the sun fell in a blaze of red across the plains, the riders finally came, 6 of them, dark figures against the dying light, moving slow but certain toward the ranch. Dust rose behind their horses, and the thud of hooves carried across the ground like distant thunder. The widows stood in the doorway, their eyes wide but unflinching. The cowboy stepped forward, rifle in hand, and felt a calm settle over him. He had spent years running from his past, but now it was clear everything had led to this moment. Riders halted 100 yards from the house. Their leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek, called out, his voice sharp in the evening air. He demanded the widows, said they belonged to him, said they had run long enough. The cowboy felt the women stiffen behind him, heard their sharp breaths, and saw the fear flash across their faces. That was all the answer he needed. He raised his rifle and leveled it at the leader. "You'll not take them," the cowboy said, his voice steady, carrying across the open space. For a moment, silence held. Then the scarred man laughed, a harsh sound, and spurred his horse forward. But before he could come closer, the oldest widow stepped out beside the cowboy, her face hard, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. She shouted words in her own tongue, words the riders clearly understood. The scarred man's smile faltered. The cowboy didn't know what she had said, but he knew it carried weight. What followed was not the bloody clash he had braced for. Instead, it became a standoff, tense and razor-thin. The riders circled, their hands on their weapons, but the cowboy and the widow stood firm. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, the standoff stretching until the riders finally pulled back. The scarred man spat into the dirt, his eyes promising this was not finished, but for now, they turned their horses and rode into the fading light. The cowboy did not lower his rifle until they disappeared beyond the hills. When the silence settled again, the widow seemed to sag with relief. But the cowboy knew better than to think it was over. He turned to them, his voice firm. They'll be back. Maybe tomorrow, maybe a month from now. But they'll be back. The women nodded, their faces somber. They had lived too long with this shadow to believe otherwise. That night, around the fire, the widows finally told him everything. The scarred man had once held power over their village. When their husbands were gone, he tried to claim them as his own. They refused, and for that, he hunted them, determined to break their will. They had fled miles upon miles, seeking shelter wherever they could, but nowhere had held until the Cowboy's ranch. Their voices shook as they spoke, but there was strength in their telling, a strength that came from surviving. The Cowboy listened, without interrupting, his chest heavy with anger and sorrow. He realized then why they had chosen his ranch, why they had begged for shelter. It wasn't chance, it was the last hope they had. And now that hope was tied to him. In the days that followed, the land was quiet again, but it was a fragile quiet, the kind that hangs after a storm but before another. The Cowboy and the widows worked side by side to strengthen the ranch. They built higher fences, set traps along the edges of the property, and made plans for what might come. The Cowboy felt his solitude slipping away, replaced by something larger. For the first time in years, his life had meaning beyond himself. The townsfolk, too, began to change. Word spread of the standoff, of how the Cowboy had stood firm against the riders. At first, there was only more suspicion, more whispers. But slowly, respect began to edge into their voices. Some offered quiet nods when he came to town, others looked away but said nothing. It was a small shift, but it mattered. Out here, respect was often the only thing that kept peace. As winter deepened, the ranch took on a new kind of life. The widows planted what seeds they could indoors, mended clothes, and kept the fires burning. The Cowboy found himself speaking more than he had in years, sharing small stories of his past, even if never the whole truth. In return, the widows shared fragments of their own lives before the sorrow, memories of laughter, of children, of songs sung around fires much like this one. It wasn't enough to erase what they had lost, but it was enough to remind them of what still endured. Weeks passed without another sign of the riders. The Cowboy knew they hadn't given up, but for now, there was peace. And in that peace, he found something he hadn't dared to hope for: belonging. He had spent so long believing his life was meant to be lived alone that silence was the only answer to grief. But now, with the widows beside him, he saw how wrong he had been. Solitude had been his shield, but it had also been his prison. The widows, too, began to change. Their laughter returned more often, their eyes brighter, their shoulders less weighed down. They still carried sorrow, but it no longer defined them. Together with the Cowboy, they built something new, fragile but real. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the land stretched wide before them, the oldest widow stood beside the Cowboy on the porch. She looked out across the horizon, then at him. "You gave us more than shelter," she said quietly. "You gave us a place to stand." The Cowboy didn't answer right away. He stared out at the land, the fences, the barn, the house that had once been only his. For the first time in years, it felt alive. He turned to her finally and gave a small nod. "You gave me the same," he said, and that was the truth. The riders might return one day, and the threat might never truly fade. But what mattered now was that the Cowboy and the widows no longer faced it alone. They had found strength in one another, and in that strength, they had carved out something worth protecting. The ranch remained quiet, but no longer hollow. It was a place of survival, of resilience, of people who had lost much but still chose to endure. The Cowboy, once buried in silence, had found his voice again, not in words, but in the simple act of standing alongside others. As the wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and earth, the cowboy knew. His days of solitude were gone. In their place stood something far greater, a shared life, fragile but strong, built on courage, loss, and the unyielding will to keep going. And in that truth, he found peace. The kind of peace that came not from silence, but from belonging. The kind of peace that would last no matter what storms might come again.